The final prefabricated wall panel for Cabin 83 swung into place on its foundation, and that's when I picked up the phone. Not to the sheriff, not to the county, but to my lawyer. I stood on the crest of the hill that separated my deeded property from the burgeoning, soulless development they called Mountain View Estates, the bitter irony of the name like ash in my mouth. They hadn't just stolen the view, they'd stolen the mountain it was on. "They're done, Elias," I said into the phone, my voice as calm and steady as the granite boulders my grandfather had taught me to identify as a boy. From my vantage point, I could see her, the architect of this theft, holding court near the newly installed community mailbox kiosk. Karen, the HOA president, a woman whose physical presence was as imposing as her sense of entitlement. She was pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward my land, her voice carrying on the crisp autumn air a shrill beacon of her own self-importance. She was showing off her conquest to a couple who looked like they'd just stepped out of a catalog for overpriced fleece vests. I ended the call and started walking down the gentle slope, my worn leather boots making no sound on the thick bed of pine needles. This was a walk I knew by heart, a path worn into the earth by my father, and his father before him. Every rock, every root was a memory. And now every memory was trespassed upon. As I approached, Karen's smile, a strained slash of crimson lipstick, tightened. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she announced, her voice dripping with condescension. "Come to admire what real progress looks like, Mr. Miller?" The fleece vest couple shifted uncomfortably, sensing a confrontation they hadn't paid for in their HOA dues. I ignored them and stopped a respectful 10 feet from her. "Karen," I said, my tone even, "we've had this conversation. You've built 83 structures on my property. The construction is now complete. I'm here to inform you that this is the last day you or any of your people will set foot on this land without my express permission." Her laugh was a harsh, barking sound that startled a nearby blue jay into flight. "Your land? Oh, this is rich. We have the survey, honey. We have the permits. We have the county's blessing. What do you have? A dusty old deed and a bad attitude." She thrust a rolled-up document into my chest, a so-called plat map her brother-in-law's firm had rubber-stamped. "This," she sneered, "is reality. Your fantasy ends at that sad little patch of weeds you call a yard. In fact, I have a notice for you right here." She produced a crisp envelope from her oversized purse. "That's a $2,000 fine for unapproved overgrowth and failure to maintain a visual corridor. Pay up, or we'll put a lien on your shack." The public humiliation was the point. She wanted to break me in front of her new acolytes to establish her dominance. She saw a quiet man who'd been away for 20 years, a relic who didn't understand how the world worked now. She didn't see a master sergeant from the Army Corps of Engineers who'd spent 2 decades drawing lines in the sand, both literally and figuratively. She didn't know that my patience wasn't weakness. It was a weapon. I took the fine from her hand, my eyes never leaving hers. "This will all be settled soon enough, Karen. Enjoy your celebration." I turned and walked away, her laughter following me up the hill. It was the last time I would ever hear her laugh with genuine confidence. If you're watching this, I need you to do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're from and if you've ever had your own run-in with an out-of-control HOA. Your stories matter, because this kind of thing happens in the dark, and it's time we all brought it into the light. Now let me tell you how this all started. I inherited this land, 250 acres of pristine Appalachian forest, from my grandfather, a man tougher than the hickory trees that dotted his property. He bought it in 1946 with the money he'd saved before shipping off to Europe. For him, this land wasn't an investment, it was a sanctuary, a promise of peace. He spent a full year walking every inch of it, driving iron survey markers deep into the earth at every corner, markers he forged himself in his own small smithy. He documented everything in a leather-bound ledger with maps drawn by a hand as steady as his character. When I came back from my final tour, all I wanted was that same peace. I'd spent my career mapping terrain in places most people only see in grim news reports. I understood the sanctity of a boundary line better than anyone. I came home to retire, to fix up my grandfather's old cabin, and to live quietly. But I returned to find the first foundations being poured, a cancer spreading across the lower 90 acres of my inheritance. Karen and her Mountain View estates had already redrawn the world to suit their needs, and they had drawn me as the villain for simply wanting what was mine. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a quiet veteran. They were about to meet a master surveyor with a 20-year grudge against bullies, and a trunk full of evidence that would bring their entire world crashing down. The war room was my grandfather's study, a small, cedar-paneled space that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. While Karen and her cronies were clinking champagne glasses to celebrate their grand theft, I was unrolling history on the heavy oak desk. The document was a masterpiece of analog precision. It was the original survey plat from 1946, a sprawling piece of vellum, yellowed with age but with ink as sharp as the day it was drawn. Every line was drafted by hand, every angle calculated with a slide rule and trigonometry, every bearing noted in my grandfather's elegant, disciplined script. Attached with a brass pin was the county recorder's stamp, embossed and dated, making it an undisputed legal instrument. But the map was only part of the arsenal. In a heavy wooden footlocker, I found the rest, the ledgers. Page after page of my grandfather's notes detailed the placement of each of the 17 iron survey markers that defined the property. He'd triangulated each one from permanent natural landmarks, a unique granite outcrop, a 500-year-old white oak, the confluence of two creeks. He'd even taken photographs, black and white images showing a younger version of him proud and smiling, with a hand resting on each newly set stake. This wasn't just a survey, it was a biography of the land itself. I spread Karen's fraudulent map, the one she'd shoved into my chest next to it. The contrast was insulting. Hers was a cheap digital printout, a soulless grid generated by a GPS unit that was likely miscalibrated or more likely deliberately manipulated. The lines were clean, but they were lies. Her survey lopped off the entire southern third of my property, a 90-acre parcel of rolling hills and hardwood forest that was now the site of 83 identical beige-colored cabins. The theft was so audacious, so brazen, it was almost brilliant. They had counted on the original owner being dead and his heir being ignorant or easily intimidated. My military training took over, silencing the hot rage that simmered in my gut. Emotion was a liability. This was a mission, and it required strategy, not a frontal assault. A direct, immediate confrontation would devolve into a messy he-said-she-said battle that would bog down in county bureaucracy for years. They had the momentum, the money, and the veneer of official approval. A shouting match would only make me look like a crazy old coot. No, the key to victory was to let the enemy overextend, to let them build their monument to greed on a foundation of illegal sand. I called Elias Vance, a man I'd served with in the Corps. He'd traded his combat boots for wingtips, but he still had the heart of a soldier. "Elias," I said, laying out the two maps side by side on the floor so my phone's camera could see them. "I've got the primary evidence, original 1946 survey filed and recorded, and I have their forgery." I could almost hear the slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Jack, my friend," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this is what we lawyers call a target-rich environment. What's the status of the construction?" "They just finished the last cabin," I replied. "They're selling them as fast as they can build them." "Good," Elias said, the words sharp and final. Let them sell every last one. Let the new owners move in, hang their curtains, and plant their petunias. Let the HOA collect its first round of dues. We do not fire a single shot until the enemy has fully occupied the kill zone. Every nail they hammered is another dollar in damages. Every fraudulent sale is another count of conspiracy. We're not just getting your land back, Jack. We're going to own the entire operation. The plan was cold, calculated, and ruthless. It felt right. For the next several months, I was to do nothing. I was to absorb the fines, endure the taunts, and watch them celebrate on my stolen land. My role was to play the part of the defeated old man, to lull them into a state of absolute, unshakable arrogance. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do, to stand by and watch strangers carve up my family's legacy, but I knew that every day that passed, every dollar they spent, was just twisting the spring of the trap tighter, and when it finally sprung, it would be devastating. The next phase of the operation was intelligence gathering, a skill honed over 2 decades of mapping hostile territory. I became a ghost on my own land, a silent observer in plain sight. I adopted a new persona, the slightly dotty, harmless old veteran, beaten down by the inexorable march of progress. I'd take my morning walks along the perimeter, not the fraudulent one Karen had established, but the true one my grandfather had marked. I carried an old pair of binoculars and a bird-watching guide, making a show of looking up at the trees whenever an HOA patrol golf cart rumbled past. They'd see me, sometimes wave with a smirk, and write me off as a sad, eccentric recluse. They had no idea I was documenting every move they made. I had a small, high-resolution camera with a powerful zoom lens. From the cover of the dense woods on my side of the line, I photographed every construction vehicle, logging the license plates and company logos. I documented the crews as they bulldozed a new access road, a road that cut directly across the land described in my grandfather's deed. I recorded dates, times, and activities in a new ledger, just as he had done, creating a meticulous record of the invasion. My most valuable sources, however, were the construction workers themselves. During their lunch breaks, I'd wander over, not with accusations, but with a thermos of hot coffee on cold days or a cooler of cold water in the heat. I was just a lonely old guy looking for a little conversation. They saw a fellow working man, not an enemy landowner. Over sandwiches and coffee, I'd listen. I learned that the project was constantly behind schedule and over budget. I heard whispers that Karen had promised the construction foreman a hefty bonus for cutting corners on erosion control and getting the project done before the winter snows. I learned that the surveyor, a man named Chet, was Karen's brother-in-law, and that he'd spent a grand total of 3 hours on site with a handheld GPS before producing the map that stole 90 acres of my life. Every casual conversation was a piece of the mosaic, a detail that Elias would later use to dismantle their entire case. My greatest ally came in the form of my neighbor, Arthur Henderson. Arthur was 80 years old, with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that had seen this valley change for 8 decades. Initially, he was wary of me, another newcomer in his mind. But one afternoon, he saw me clearing the brush away from one of the original iron survey markers near his property line. He came over, a curious but suspicious look on his face. "What do you think you're doing there?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my brow. "Just checking on my granddad's marker," I said. "Name's Jack Miller." "My grandfather was Frank Miller." Arthur's eyes widened. The suspicion melted away, replaced by a flicker of recognition, then a slow smile. "Frank Miller's boy? I'll be damned. I thought you were one of them." From that moment on, we were allies. Arthur's memory was a living archive. He remembered my grandfather setting those markers. He remembered walking these hills with him as a boy. He told me about Karen's rise to power in the HOA, how she'd used a combination of charm, intimidation, and procedural manipulation to take control, pushing out anyone who questioned her. He confirmed that the land had always unequivocally been known as the Miller property. He had old photographs of his own, showing family picnics on the hill where Cabin 47 now stood, with my grandfather's fence line clearly visible in the background. He became my eyes and ears, reporting on the gossip from the HOA meetings he was still forced to attend. The final piece of my intelligence operation was technological. Under the cover of darkness, I installed a series of motion-activated trail cameras along the true property line. They were military-grade, weatherproof, and nearly invisible against the bark of the trees. These cameras were my silent sentinels. They captured everything. They captured the HOA's hired landscaping crews illegally dumping yard waste on my property. They captured teenagers from the development having parties and leaving their trash behind. And then I hit the jackpot. One evening, a camera captured crystal clear footage of Karen herself along with her brother-in-law, Chet the surveyor. They were standing right next to one of my grandfather's most prominent iron markers. The video, date, and time stamped showed Chet trying to pry the marker out of the ground with a crowbar. When he failed, Karen, in a fit of pique, directed him to cover it with a pile of rocks and dirt, effectively concealing a registered survey monument. I watched the footage on my laptop, a cold, hard knot of satisfaction forming in my stomach. This wasn't just a civil dispute anymore. This was a felony. I saved the file to a secure, encrypted drive and sent a copy to Elias. His response was a single, chilling text message: checkmate. With our intelligence secured, Elias Vance began to move the legal pieces into position on the board. He started quietly filing a preliminary quiet title action with the county court. It's a legal maneuver that doesn't scream for attention but serves as a formal declaration that ownership of a property is in dispute. He followed it up by filing a les pendens, a Latin term that essentially means suit pending. This notice was recorded against the property deeds of the entire Mountain View Estates development. It didn't stop the sales or construction, not yet, but it acted as a poison pill. It was a public record, a red flag for any title insurance company, mortgage lender, or potential buyer diligent enough to do a proper search. It was the first almost invisible crack in the foundation of Karen's empire. The official notice was delivered to Karen via a certified letter, which she signed for with a flourish, assuming it was just another piece of bureaucratic nonsense. According to the process server's report, she glanced at the legal heading, scoffed, and tossed it onto a pile of mail without reading it. Her arrogance was a tactical advantage we had counted on. A week later, she got her first call from a title company about the cloud on the title for a pending sale. That she couldn't ignore. Her response was exactly what we had predicted. Instead of consulting a competent lawyer, she went on the offensive. She called a special emergency meeting of the HOA, a public spectacle designed to rally her followers and crucify me. Arthur Henderson attended, sitting in the back, and gave me a full report. The community clubhouse, itself built 20 feet inside my property line, was packed. Karen stood at a lectern, her face a mask of righteous indignation. She held up the les pendens notice. "Our new neighbor, Mr. Miller," she began, her voice quivering with faux outrage, "has decided to welcome himself to our community by suing us. He is a greedy, litigious man who is trying to extort money from our hardworking families. He is filing frivolous lawsuits to try and stop our progress, to bleed our community dry with legal fees." She painted me as a monster, a shadowy outsider who hated progress, community, and probably puppies. She assured everyone that her lawyers, likely the same ones who handled the HOA's collections, had looked at it and declared it a baseless nuisance suit. She promised them she would not only defeat it, but that she would countersue me for legal fees and harassment, and that the HOA would use its full power to make my life a living hell. She was met with a round of thunderous applause. The new cabin owners, high on their mountain dream and terrified of anything that might threaten their investment, were putty in her hands. The threats began arriving almost immediately. The initial fine for unapproved overgrowth was followed by a flood of others. I was fined $500 for a non-conforming mailbox, even though my mailbox predated the HOA by 50 years. I was fined $1,000 for unauthorized parking of a commercial vehicle when my 20-year-old pickup truck was parked in my own driveway. I was fined for the color of my trim, the state of my gravel driveway, and for having a visually disruptive woodpile. Each violation notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak. citing bylaws that were either completely irrelevant or newly invented. It was a classic war of attrition, designed to bury me in paperwork and bleed me dry with 1,000 tiny cuts. But they didn't know that I had my own secret weapon, my daughter Sarah. She was in her second year of law school, and she dove into the project with a ferocity that made me proud. She organized every notice, every threat, every piece of correspondence from the HOA into a set of meticulously indexed binders. She cross-referenced the fines with the HOA's own published bylaws, highlighting the inconsistencies and contradictions. She created a timeline, linking Karen's escalating harassment directly to the date she received the Ellis Pendens notice. What Karen saw as a barrage of intimidating paperwork, Sarah was transforming into Exhibit A, B, and C in a case for targeted harassment and abuse of power. While Karen thought she was burying me, she was actually handing us the shovel to dig her own grave. I paid none of the fines. I simply filed each one away, another log on the fire that was about to consume her. The trap was baited, the intelligence was gathered, and the legal groundwork was laid. All we had to do was wait for the perfect moment to spring it. That moment arrived on a brilliant Saturday in late October, the peak of the autumn leaf season. Karen and the HOA were hosting the official grand opening of Mountain View Estates. It was the culmination of her grand vision, her moment of ultimate triumph. They had invited local politicians, real estate brokers from across the state, and a reporter from the regional newspaper. A large white tent was erected on the community green, which was, of course, a beautifully manicured section of my hayfield. A string quartet was playing. Caterers were serving champagne and canapes. Karen was in her element, resplendent in a flowy floral print dress, gliding through the crowd, accepting congratulations, her voice echoing with pronouncements about community, vision, and shared prosperity. I watched it all from my porch through the binoculars, a quiet observer at my own execution party. Elias had hired a local independent process server, a big, no-nonsense man named Dave, and 2 off-duty sheriff's deputies for security. They were parked down the road waiting for my signal. At precisely 2 p.m., just as the county commissioner was stepping up to the podium to present Karen with a ceremonial plaque, I gave Elias the signal. "Showtime," he relayed the order. Dave's sedan pulled up to the entrance of the development. He and the 2 deputies got out and began walking calmly and deliberately toward the celebration tent. They weren't rushing. Their steady, purposeful pace was far more intimidating. The music faltered as people began to notice the uniformed officers. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen, who was standing beside the podium, saw them coming, and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. She probably assumed they were uninvited security crashers. She stepped forward to intercept them, her hand raised. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with authority. "This is a private event." Dave didn't break stride. He held up a thick manila envelope. "Are you Karen Schmidt, president of the Mountain View Estates Homeowners Association?" he asked, his voice booming through the sudden silence. "I am," she said, puffing out her chest, "and you are trespassing." "Ma'am," Dave said, his expression unreadable, "I have a court summons for you personally, and for you as the representative of the HOA." He handed her the envelope. In front of the politicians, the reporter, and all her loyal subjects, he served her. This wasn't just the quiet title action anymore. This was the full, amended complaint. Elias had unleashed the entire arsenal. The lawsuit now named the HOA Karen Schmidt personally for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud, her brother-in-law Chet's surveying company for professional negligence and conspiracy, and the construction company for trespassing and unjust enrichment. The complaint included claims for ejectment, the legal term for kicking them off my land, damages for the timber that was illegally cleared, damages for the cost of restoring the land to its original condition, and, the master stroke, a claim for conversion of property. We weren't just suing for the land back, we were claiming legal ownership of all permanent structures that had been illegally affixed to it. We were suing for the 83 cabins, the damages totaled in the tens of millions of dollars. Karen's face went from crimson to ghost white as she pulled the thick sheaf of papers from the envelope. The string quartet had fallen completely silent. The only sound was the rustling of the legal documents in her trembling hands. The reporter, sensing the story of a lifetime, was already snapping photos. The county commissioner slowly backed away from the podium as if she were radioactive. The grand opening was over. The party had come to a screeching, catastrophic halt. The trap so patiently set had finally and beautifully sprung. The public humiliation was absolute, a perfect mirror of the way she had tried to humiliate me. It was a cinematic moment of pure, unadulterated karmic justice. The aftermath of the grand opening ambush was pure chaos. Panic, like a wildfire, ripped through the freshly sodded lawns of Mountain View Estates. The news of the lawsuit spread instantly, amplified by the presence of the reporter whose story, complete with a photo of a stunned Karen holding the summons, was on the front page of the regional paper the next morning. The cabin owners, who just a day before had been toasting their good fortune, were now in a state of terror. Their idyllic mountain getaways, their multi-$100,000 investments were built on a legal sinkhole. The phones at the county recorder's office and every title insurance agency in the state began ringing off the hook. Mortgage lenders immediately froze all pending loans and initiated fraud investigations. The entire development was instantly toxic. Karen's first instinct was to double down on her lies. She sent out a frantic, typo-ridden email blast to all homeowners, calling the lawsuit a desperate and malicious stunt, and promising a swift legal victory. She called another emergency meeting, but this time the atmosphere was different. The fawning adoration was gone, replaced by fear and pointed questions. "Did you know about this claim before we closed? Is my title insurance void? Are you saying we don't actually own the land our house is on?" Karen tried to deflect and bluster, but her usual tactics were failing. The foundation of trust had been shattered. She was no longer their visionary leader. She was the person who had led them off a cliff. It was at this point that Elias and I made our next move. We decided to speak directly to the homeowners, to treat them not as adversaries but as fellow victims of Karen's scheme. We rented a conference room at a hotel in the nearby town and sent a formal, printed invitation to every single cabin owner. The invitation was polite, professional, and promised a full and transparent presentation of the facts regarding the Miller property line dispute. Over 70 of the 83 households showed up. The mood in the room was tense, a mixture of anger, fear, and desperation. They saw me as the man who was about to take their homes. I let Elias speak first. He was calm, authoritative, and didn't use a single word of confusing legalese. He simply laid out the facts. He projected my grandfather's 1946 survey map onto a large screen, followed by the county record stamp. Then he showed the corresponding pages from the ledger, the old black and white photos of my grandfather setting the iron markers. He followed it with an overlay, showing the true property line against the development plat, the red line of my ownership cutting a brutal swathe right through their homes. The room was deathly silent. Then I stood up to speak. I didn't talk about lawsuits or damages. I talked about my grandfather. I told them about how he bought this land after the war, how he saw it as a place of peace, a legacy for his family. I told them about my own service and how I came back here seeking that same peace, only to find my inheritance being bulldozed. "I don't blame any of you," I said, looking around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. "You bought a dream that you were told was real. You were sold a lie by a person you trusted. In that sense, we are all victims of the same fraud. My fight is not with you. My fight is with the people who knowingly and willfully stole my land and sold it to you." This was the turning point. I had reframed the conflict. I wasn't the enemy trying to take their homes. I was an ally in the fight against a common foe. After the presentation, I stayed for over an hour, answering every question honestly. I showed them copies of the documents. I explained how the survey markers had been moved or concealed, By the end of the evening, the anger that had been directed at me had been redirected squarely where it belonged, at Karen Schmidt. The HOA was fractured beyond repair. Within a week, a large contingent of homeowners had hired their own lawyer not to fight me, but to explore their legal options against the HOA and Karen herself. The alliance was formed. Karen was no longer just fighting me. She was fighting the very community she had created. The legal discovery process was like turning over a large flat rock and watching all the slimy things underneath scurry for cover. Elias's team was relentless. They filed subpoenas for every email, every text message, every internal memo related to the Mountain View Estates project. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, but Sarah, with the meticulous mind of a future top litigator, organized it all, creating a damning timeline of deceit. The depositions were the main event. Karen was first. She marched into the conference room with her discount HOA lawyer, projecting an air of bored indignation. But under Elias's precise, methodical questioning, her composure disintegrated. She contradicted herself repeatedly. She claimed to have relied entirely on the expertise of her surveyor, then admitted to pressuring him to finish the plat map in time for a grant application deadline. When Elias presented her with emails in which she explicitly told the construction company to ignore the old fence posts and follow Chet's new stakes, she stammered that she couldn't recall the context. By the end of the 8-hour session, she was a sputtering, incoherent mess. Her brother-in-law, Chet, folded even faster. Faced with losing his professional license and a mountain of evidence of negligence, he crumbled. He admitted on the record that he had used an outdated, low-resolution satellite map as his primary reference because a full ground survey would have been too time-consuming and expensive. He admitted he couldn't locate most of the original survey markers and instead approximated the boundary line based on Karen's instructions. His testimony was a confession, and it implicated Karen directly in the conspiracy, but the most powerful piece of evidence remained the trail camera footage. In a separate deposition, Elias's team questioned Karen about the survey markers. "Ms. Schmidt," Elias asked calmly, "were you at any time aware of the existence of historical iron survey markers on the boundary of the Miller property?" "Absolutely not," she lied, looking him straight in the eye. "If such markers existed, your clients certainly never pointed them out to me." Elias paused, letting the lie hang in the air. Then his paralegal placed a laptop on the table and turned it to face her. "Could you please watch this short video and tell me if you recognize the people in it?" He pressed play. The grainy nighttime footage filled the screen. There she was, clear as day, her face illuminated by Chet's flashlight. Her voice, tinny but unmistakable, was captured by the camera's microphone. "Just get rid of it, Chet," the video showed her saying. "Nobody will ever know. Pile some rocks on it." The color drained from Karen's face. Her lawyer put his head in his hands. It was the kill shot. This wasn't just evidence of fraud in a civil case anymore. This was a felony. Willful destruction of a survey monument. Elias had already forwarded the video, along with Chet's and Karen's contradictory depositions, to the county district attorney's office. He didn't just file a complaint. He handed them a fully packaged criminal case on a silver platter. The wheels of a different kind of justice, one with the potential for jail time, began to grind. The civil suit was about my land. The criminal investigation was about putting Karen away. With her legal case in shambles and a criminal investigation looming, Karen made a last, desperate gamble. She tried to win in the court of public opinion. She contacted the same regional newspaper that had covered her public humiliation and gave them an exclusive interview. She spun a sob story, painting herself as a well-meaning community leader who was being persecuted by a wealthy, ruthless developer, me, who wanted to destroy their beautiful neighborhood. She claimed I was the one trying to defraud the hard-working families of Mountain View Estates. The article was slanted in her favor, filled with quotes about her love for the community and her vision for a better future. It was a well-crafted piece of propaganda, and for a few days it worked. The tide of local sentiment began to turn against me. People who didn't know the facts saw a David and Goliath story, only they had cast the roles incorrectly. Elias knew we had to respond. He arranged for me to have one interview and one interview only with a respected investigative journalist from a larger statewide television station. I didn't want to do it. I hated the spotlight, but Elias was firm. "You're the mission, Jack," he said, "and the mission requires this." The interview took place on my porch, with the rolling hills of my true property in the background. I wasn't polished or slick. I just told the truth. I showed the journalist my grandfather's handwritten ledger. I unrolled the original 1946 vellum map on the porch railing. I spoke about my family's history with this land, about what it meant to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack Karen. I simply laid out the facts calmly and methodically. I explained the survey, the markers, and the systematic theft. The contrast between my quiet, fact-based presentation and Karen's emotional, accusatory interview was stark. When the story aired, it included shots of the dueling survey maps, close-ups of my grandfather's notarized documents, and an interview with the stoic Arthur Henderson, who confirmed my family's ownership for the last 70 years. The public saw the truth. I wasn't a developer. I was a veteran defending his inheritance. Karen wasn't a community leader. She was a con artist. The television piece had an immediate and decisive effect on the one entity that mattered most: the county government. They had been trying to stay out of the fight, hoping it would resolve itself, but now they were exposed. The story highlighted their negligence in approving a fraudulent plat map without due diligence. Facing a massive lawsuit from me and now a potential class action suit from all the cabin owners they'd allowed to be defrauded, the county commission caved. They called an emergency session and voted unanimously to invalidate the Mountain View Estates plat map. They issued a formal public apology to me and the homeowners and announced a full-scale internal investigation into the planning department. It was a complete and total capitulation. This was the domino that brought everything else down. The surveyor's professional liability insurance company, faced with irrefutable proof of their client's negligence and criminal conduct, immediately contacted Elias and offered to settle for the maximum value of their policy. The construction company, facing their own massive liability for trespassing and illegal conversion, did the same. Both settlements were substantial, covering all of my legal fees and then some, but more importantly, they were a legal admission of guilt. It left Karen and the HOA completely isolated, stripped of their allies and their veneer of legitimacy. They were now the sole defendants in a multi-million-dollar fraud case they had no possible way of winning. The walls weren't just closing in, they had already collapsed. The final act took place fittingly in the community clubhouse built on my land. The HOA was financially ruined, its operating accounts frozen by court order, and its coffers drained by Karen's incompetent legal defense. The faction of homeowners who had allied with me now represented a clear majority, and they had forced one last, desperate meeting. Their goal was simple: to formally remove Karen from power and dissolve the fraudulent HOA. At their lawyer's invitation, I attended. I walked into the room and sat in the back, a silent observer. The energy was the polar opposite of the triumphant grand opening. The air was thick with anger, betrayal, and despair. Karen stood at the podium, no longer the confident visionary, but a cornered animal. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes darting nervously around the room, finding only hostile faces. She tried to give a speech, a rambling, incoherent diatribe about betrayal and gratitude. She blamed me, she blamed her lawyer, she blamed the county, she blamed the homeowners for not having enough faith in her. But no one was listening. A man who owned one of the cabins stood up. "Karen, we're not here to listen to your excuses," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "We're here to take our community back. I call for a vote of no confidence and for your immediate removal as president of this association." The motion was seconded by a dozen voices at once. This was the moment her psyche finally shattered. The last vestige of her power was being stripped away, and she couldn't handle it. She began to scream. It wasn't a shout. It was a raw, primal shriek of pure narcissistic rage. "You ungrateful people," she bellowed, her voice cracking. "I built this for you. I gave you this beautiful community. I did what had to be done to make it happen. I bent the rules for your benefit. This was all for you." In her spectacular meltdown, in front of a room full of witnesses and with the homeowner's lawyer recording the entire meeting on his phone, she confessed. She admitted to everything, framing her crimes as noble sacrifices for the greater good. It was the final nail in her own coffin. The vote was a mere formality. She was removed from her position unanimously. As the meeting broke up, with people shouting at her and her world crumbling around her, 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies walked into the room. They were not the off-duty security I had hired. These were on-duty officers acting on a warrant issued by the district attorney. One of them approached the now sobbing Karen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Karen Schmidt, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, filing a false instrument, and willful destruction of a survey monument." They cuffed her hands behind her back and led her out of the clubhouse she had built on my stolen land, past the faces of the people she had betrayed. Her downfall was not quiet or private. It was a public spectacle of her own making, a fittingly dramatic end to her reign of tyranny. In the end, justice was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, methodical reconstruction of what was right. With Karen facing criminal charges and the HOA officially dissolved by court order, the legal ownership of the 90-acre parcel and all 83 cabins reverted to me, free and clear. I was, on paper, the landlord of an entire village I never wanted. The cabin owners were in a state of legal limbo, technically tenants on my property with no lease and no rights. The anger they once felt was replaced by a quiet dread. They expected me to bring in the bulldozers, or at the very least to evict them all and sell the cabins to the highest bidder. That would have been the profitable thing to do. It would have been the vengeful thing to do, but it wouldn't have been the right thing to do. My grandfather didn't cherish this land because of its monetary value. He cherished it as a place of peace and principle. To honor him, I had to find a solution that reflected those values. I spent a week walking the property, not as a conqueror surveying his spoils, but as a custodian trying to figure out how to heal the scars. I spoke again with my daughter Sarah, whose legal insights had been invaluable, and with my lawyer Elias. We devised a plan. We called a final meeting with the homeowners, not in a sterile hotel conference room, but on the community green, under the open sky. I stood before them, not as their adversary or their landlord, but as their neighbor. "You all came here looking for a home, a place of peace in the mountains," I began. "You were cheated, and I am sorry for what you have been through. I have no intention of kicking a single person out of their home." A collective, audible sigh of relief went through the crowd. "However," I continued, "we have to make this right. The land beneath your homes is and has always been Miller land. We cannot build a new community on an old lie." I then laid out my proposal. I would not sell them the land. My family's legacy wasn't for sale. Instead, I offered to create a land trust, with the 90 acres placed into it permanently. I would then grant each of them a 99-year land lease for the plot their cabin sat on for a nominal fee of $1 per year. The lease would be transferable if they sold their cabin, securing their investment. In return for the lease, they would agree to form a new democratic community association, with strict bylaws written to prevent anyone like Karen from ever taking power again. This new association would be responsible for maintaining the roads and common areas. Any dues they collected would not go to me, but into a fund managed by the trust, dedicated to the preservation and restoration of the surrounding forest, including the 160 acres of my land they hadn't managed to pave over. It was an unconventional solution. It was based not on maximizing profit, but on restoring balance and establishing a principle. They would get to keep their homes and their dream, but they would do so on a foundation of truth, acknowledging the history and the rightful ownership of the land. They would become partners in its preservation, not just consumers of its views. They agreed, unanimously and gratefully. The legal documents were drawn up, and one by one the cabin owners came to my grandfather's old house to sign their leases on the heavy oak desk where my campaign began. Many of them shook my hand, their eyes filled with a gratitude that was far more valuable than any amount of money. The final scene of this long drama was quiet. A few months later, on a warm spring day, I was walking the old perimeter with Sarah and Arthur Henderson. The new community was quiet, respectful. The ugly, oversized Mountain View Estates sign had been taken down, replaced by a simple carved wooden sign that just said Miller's Ridge. We stopped at the spot where Karen had tried to destroy my grandfather's survey marker. I had uncovered it, cleaned the rust from it, and painted the top bright orange, as is proper for a survey monument. It stood as a silent iron testament to the endurance of truth. I looked out at the cabins, no longer with anger, but with a sense of peace. I hadn't just won a lawsuit. I had reclaimed my grandfather's legacy, not by expelling the intruders, but by teaching them to live in harmony with the land, to respect its history, and to honor the lines that define not just property, but our character. Justice had been served, the community was healing, and the mountain, my mountain, was finally at peace.